Welcome to Chapter 1. In this chapter, we'll introduce how the economy is currently built, as we see it today, essentially. We'll discuss the trend that is emerging, where barriers to entry into foreign countries such as China and India are being lifted, and trade is expanding, and investments into these countries are also growing. We'll examine the different economic systems that are played out on the global scale that have helped lift these barrier to entry and also generate interest in investment. We'll discuss some of the financial components of global trade, such as the fact that there's $4 trillion in foreign exchange transactions that happen daily, or that there's $18 trillion of goods and $14 trillion of services that are sold across borders on a regular basis, if you will. And then we'll also establish the international institutions that help govern some of these transactions that we've discussed. But before we jump into that level of granularity, let's answer the big question. What is globalization? How does this process truly unfold itself in this economy that we live in today? Globalization refers to the trend where more and more economies are integrated on a global scale. Nations are starting to participate in transactions across borders, essentially. The other day, we had a problem with our charger for our iPhones. My wife jumped on Amazon, found a charger for 20 bucks, ordered it. It arrived a few weeks later, essentially. And it was substantially cheaper than the chargers that they sell on Apple and their website in particular. A large reason for that is because the charger was produced in China. And through Amazon, we were able to complete that transaction with a foreign entity. Now, when we talk about these types of transactions happening, there's basically two factors to consider as we discuss the growth of interactions between nations. There's globalization of markets, and then there's also globalization of products. That being that markets are starting to integrate in more depth with one another, and products are starting to be created in multiple parts of the country. The discussion question this week focused on Apple and how they've been able to leverage this global economy that we live in. So let's tackle that first part. What does it mean to discuss globalization of markets? What does that concept entail? Historically, markets have stayed relatively separate in terms of the US made things, US consumers bought those things, and we lived in a happy little world, if you will. Today, that's no longer the case. Today, as a citizen of the United States, or really anybody residing in the United States for that matter, can order products online or even over the phone to manufacturers and really retailers that are located outside of the United States. There's a growing trend of globalization where historically product selection and value chains were limited by the nation that you lived in. In today's case, that's no longer the case, if you will. In today's markets, there are many consumers that have different preferences and tastes, and different nations can provide those products that are needed for that consumer, essentially. We have companies like Coca-Cola, Citigroup, McDonald's, and IKEA Furniture that are global companies meeting these various needs, regardless of whether or not you live in the United States, Canada, Mexico, or even overseas. As I mentioned, I'm in the hospitality business, and our growth area is overseas, as many companies are focusing upon growing their brand in Europe, in India, in China. And taking advantage of this globalization of markets is going to be key for the future of our success. I was in the Philippines, which actually I'm from, born and raised. To some degree, I left when I was 5, so more than likely born, less raised, an American in all truth. But I was there visiting my family, and I was there for about 2 weeks, and I was dying for a cup of coffee. I saw a Starbucks, and I went to the Starbucks, and I bought a Starbucks in the Philippines. And that cup of coffee tasted exactly as it does in Chicago, where I went to undergrad, if you will. Globalization means there are companies such as Starbucks that bring their brand internationally and draw from the consumers in that country and also those outside the country to bring those value propositions that they offer in their originating country. And there is power in this. There is potential that needs to be tapped into. So let's talk about globalization of products then. The sourcing of goods and services from locations around the globe to take advantage of the differences in cost and quality factors. In most cases, it's cheaper to produce something outside of the United States due to labor, energy, land, and capital investments that are required. And the objective really is to reduce the overall cost structure in order to provide better value to the consumer, to the stakeholders. Now, this is a good thing and a bad thing because it also means loss of jobs for any given country and really location where those jobs are offshore now or outsourced, if you will. But the objective is to reduce costs and also improve the quality and functionality of the products that are gained. Really take advantage of what the globe has to offer, or rather, other nations, if you will. Now, there are some questions you need to pay attention to that may show up again as we go through this chapter. One of these questions is right here, actually. Highly recommend you pay attention to it. When you think about, our text and you think about the content that we're consuming, an important thing to recognize is that as this globalization takes place, this movement, there are more and more countries that are essentially interacting with one another. So when we read this question as a true or false question, as a result of globalization, we have seen a movement towards a world in which nations, and particularly these economies found in these nations, are relatively self-contained. I would probably answer this false. Over the past 3 decades, a fundamental shift has occurred in the world economy, where we've been moving away from a world in which nations are self-contained, but rather are interacting with one another. A perfect example of that is airlines and the planes that we fly in and how they're built uh, in multiple parts of the world, if you will, because of the core competencies that these different companies have developed in those countries and the economy of scale that they've been able to leverage as a result of residing in these different countries. Now, let's talk about the emergence of global institutions, because as you have people interacting with one another, governments are always going to be in play, and to some degree, specific institutions to help govern, manage, regulate these marketplaces have started to arise over the decades, and there are several important ones that you need to pay attention to. The main objective, again, for these institutions is to essentially promote the establishment of multinational trade and to govern these global business systems that have been created as a result of these interactions. The first organization is the WTO. It's the World Trade Organization. They provide policies when it comes to trading and really ensure that nations adhere to the rules that are established so that there is parity, so that there is full cooperation in terms of mutually benefiting end results for both parties, if you will. Another important organization that helps manage, regulate, and develop policies on a global scale is the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. It really maintains order in terms of the international monetary system, and you need to be aware of these entities and their role in the global marketplace. Another one that we should consider is the World Bank, which promotes economic development. Then there's obviously the United Nations, the UN, which really maintains international peace and security, because without that, trade and globalization in terms of economies can't take place. They develop friendly relations among nations. They help coordinate to solve international problems. And they promote respect for human rights. And again, trying to really emphasize that we are living in the same global planet, and there's a need for peace and interaction with one another. And harmony is a significant focus for the UN. As you can see, its involvement across the globe at different points in time and history in particular. So that raises the question, what is driving uh, greater globalization? And when we think about that answer, we've already mentioned some of it. There's a steady decline of um, barriers when we talk about trade and investment. A lot of these have been lifted post World War II, and economies stimulated to interact with each other. Secondarily, technology has radically changed the way we do business as companies and also as consumers. Being able to purchase something on a trusted platform such as Amazon, but having that retailer or the supplier located halfway around the world didn't happen until more recently, if you will, with the advancement of the internet and more specifically access to the internet across the globe. And to have access to high speed internet is a game changer that we'll look at. So another question you should pay attention to, again, true or false, a company has to be the size of a multinational giant to facilitate and benefit from the globalization of markets. False. A company does not have to be the size of a multinational giant to facilitate and benefit from the globalization of these markets. I'm just kind of reading the question back to you because the economies of scales are available now to smaller companies. I worked for a education company in Owatonna. We were e-commerce slash direct mail, and we opened up an Amazon store, and we're able to sell across the globe to Canada and Mexico. And we were able to do it because of that platform. We had an e-commerce site, and we were able to do that as well. But you don't have to be a large multinational organization to benefit from this trend, if you will. Um, let's talk about international trade and the fact that it occurs when firms export a good or service to consumers in another country. It's an important concept for you to be able to grasp it and maintain because that's what globalization is, essentially trade happening among different nations. When we talk about foreign direct investment, this basically occurs when a firm invests its resources in business activities outside of its home country. There is a huge growth trend occurring in China as that middle class starts to develop and as they grow in their purchasing power. Multiple brands are eyeing that market as the area of growth. Apple is strongly focusing on it. Our company, Interstate, is strongly focusing on it in terms of opening up new hotels in that area to really take advantage of that potential, if you will. And in order to do that, we have to invest resources in China in the business activities. We have to open up an office there. We have to hire Chinese residents to manage those businesses and leverage the core competencies that we've developed. So FTC is very important, and it's a growing trend. During the 1920s and 30s, many nations wanted to stay away from international trade and shy away from FDI. Basically, when they protect their domestic industries from foreign competition. The tone has changed today. While that's still the case, that we want to protect jobs and we want to protect our economy, the opportunity for globalization is just too large to ignore and essentially bypass. So, what are some of the declining trade and essentially, well, what are some of the barriers that have been lifted for declining trade and investments? After World War II, the Western countries began removing these trades and, well, rather these barriers, and started to focus on facilitating more of these transactions to take place and investments to be made, essentially. The forerunner to the WTO, the GATT, essentially, that comprised of over 100 nations, negotiated further decreases in tariffs and made significant progress on a number of non-tariff issues, if you will. Once the WTO started to emerge, they provided a mechanism for dispute resolution to enforce trade laws. They focused on cutting tariffs and focused on being able to produce an environment where industrial goods, services, and our actual products can be exchanged throughout the globe. And there is the barrier to cross-border investments, if you will. This ultimately lowered trade barriers and helped countries to be able to see the world as a single market, because that's what it is. A consumer in, again, China, a consumer in Europe, a consumer in Rochester, Minnesota, has the capability to buy products on a global scale. And technology has opened that up to a wider vast of consumers and a wider vast number of suppliers. They were able to establish production activity in optimal locations around the globe, thus lowering costs. This ultimately led to an acceleration in the volume of world trade and investments since 1980, essentially. And fast forward to 2015, and we see our opportunity again to grow on a global scale. Most of the companies that have matured in the United States have reached their climax in terms of new customer acquisition, and growth is mostly happening overseas. Here's another important question to pay attention to. Again, it's a true or false question. So the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the sister institution, the World Bank, and the United Nations were all created by voluntary agreements between individual nation states. This is absolutely true. These were all voluntary, and the objective was to develop organizations to help manage and enforce laws that were agreed upon in order to participate in this global trade that was benefiting most countries, if you will. Since World War II, there's been some major advances in communication, information processing, and transportation. We're getting to the second part of those two watershed moments we talked about earlier. The role of technology has changed the way we do business. The microprocessor, which most of us don't even think of, lower the cost for global communication and the cost of coordination and controlling a global organization. I have a Note 3. It's a Android device. It's a smartphone, and it has more processing power and more capabilities than a laptop that was around in 2005 when I was in college still, if you will. Significantly more processing power. The microprocessor and the abilities to do things on this device, it far outshines what I had in 2005. And many of you are probably in the same position, if you will. Technology has made your life easier, sometimes more complicated, but it's provided advances that have dramatically changed the way you interact with your world. From my Note 3, I can unlock my front door. I can set my alarm system. I can open my garage door. I have a smart house. I can turn on my TV. I can send a text, email, but I can interact with my environment in ways that I haven't been able to. And technology has brought some of those advances to us. In the US, web-based transactions account for $202 billion since 2011. And there are over 2.3 billion internet users in 2011, essentially, and that number is only growing as internet becomes faster and more accessible across the globe. This globalization is going to continue. Markets interacting with other people, buying products from other countries. Commercial jet carriers, super freights have also simplified transportation, and it's cheaper to essentially move product around the globe. So, what's the implication of these advances, if you will? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Well, again, we talked about the fact that it lowers cost transportation. It makes geographically dispersed products to be more economical in terms of production, in terms of collaboration. It really allows firms to respond better to customer demands. It's put them in a position where they have more advantages because of technology, essentially. After World War II, the advancement of nations committing to one another in terms of increasing these barriers, not true. They wanted to remove these barriers in terms of trade. So if you've ever run into a question somewhere along your path in life, particularly in an academic setting, that asked after World War II, the advancement of nations, particularly of the West, committed themselves to increasing barriers to the free flow of goods, services, and capital between nations, that's probably a false statement. They didn't commit themselves to increasing barriers, they committed themselves to lifting these barriers. Something you might want to take note of, if you will. So, what are the implications of this growth in technology? Again, this change as we think about this. Uh, it lowers cost for communication. I can remember back in the day, we used to talk to our relatives in the Philippines, where you'd have to essentially uh, dial long distance and pay an arm and a leg to talk to your family members. Nowadays, Skype is something that's just regularly practiced. Seeing them, interacting with them on a digital device happens on a regular basis, if you will. The cost of communication has drastically decreased. The cost of transportation has drastically decreased, which really enables firms to create global places and really facilitate movement of products, goods, and services. So, in the 1960s, the world was very different. The U.S. dominated the world economy, and particularly the trade and FDI, federal direct investment. Um, and it had a strong presence. About half of the world, the centrally planned economies of the world, was off limits to Western international trade due to a number of reasons. Today, a lot of that has changed. The United States used to produce its own goods and consume its own goods. That's no longer the case, as we keep talking about the fact that consumers here are now purchasing goods outside of the country, which also does raise an issue, and we'll discuss it later on in the chapter, about what are the core competencies necessary for the United States to develop in order for it to continue to survive. If it's no longer a country that produces goods, it has to evolve and be a country that adds value elsewhere. Nowadays, we are a company who excels in terms of knowledge work. People come to the US to learn how to be a doctor. People come to the US to learn how to program different languages and things of that nature, if you will. We're shifting from a work-based society to a knowledge-based society. Um, and again, a question that you should probably pay attention to is, as a result of international trade, the economies of the world's nation states are becoming less intertwined. Nothing can be further from the truth. They're becoming more intertwined. So I would answer a resulting false for this particular statement. When we think back to the 60s, again, about 30% of the world's manufacturing can be sourced to the U.S. in terms of its dominant industrial power, which is a significant position. Today, well, not even today, in 2011, that's decreased dramatically to 23.1%, and it underlines that trend. We are not a nation of goods anymore. We don't produce physical items, or rather, what we produce is knowledge, access to that knowledge, business intelligence, analyzing information. Uh, and this has forced other nations to develop the expertise in manufacturing and have caused them to replace the U.S. in terms of product placement. Other developed nations have also experienced a decline to some degree. Rapid economic growth now in countries such as China, India, and Brazil are usurping countries that historically have been producers, if you will. So instead of goods being manufactured in the U.S., in Europe, now they're in China, India, and Brazil. And the declines continue for the U.S. and will likely to continue. So many companies find both new markets and new competitors in developing regions of the world. We can see this chart here and the constant decline in terms of the percent output for each country. As we talked about, in the 60s, the United States accounted for 38.3%. In 2011, it's about 8.1%. And you can see this across the board for the developed countries. China in 2010 accounted for 9.4. Now it's accounted for 10.4, outpacing the U.S., if you will. Significant change. The internet has been a major force in facilitating international trade in services. This is an absolute true statement, and you want to pay attention to that. Now, the share of world output generated by developed countries has steadily increased, developing countries rather, sorry, has steadily increased since 1960. The stock of foreign direct investment, total cumulative in a matter of speaking, has continued to decline in developed countries and increased in developing countries. Cross-border flow of foreign direct investments are rising, essentially, with the largest recipient of the FDI in China. We can kind of see across the board when it comes to percent of share for FDI in the 1980s versus 2010 across the board from the United States to developing countries. There is an increase in FDI in developing countries. Another question to pay attention to: countries that have markedly increased their share of world output from 1960 to 1910 include Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. That is absolutely false. Actually, we're talking about an increase in places such as Japan, Thailand, Malaysia, Taiwanese, South Korea, so on and so forth, if you will. And we can kind of see that trend represented graphically here that we talked about earlier. So when we talk about a company existing in a global market, the area that we're going to dive in more depth to is discussing multinational enterprises. Basically, it's a business that does activity in more than two countries, essentially. In the 1960s, there was a rise in non-U.S. multinationals, if you will. There's been a rise in many multinationals. Companies that are smaller have been increasing in terms of their activity. Smaller to medium firms are now expanding internationally, which is a growing trend. It's easier to build international sales via the internet. Well, we can kind of see again a graphical representation of this here, and your textbook goes into a bit more depth, so we're not going to dive into it here. But because of the collapse of Eastern Europe, export and investment opportunities have started to provide themselves. Economic development in China is something that's a heavy emphasis across multiple brands, across multiple companies. And it's really a huge opportunity to continue growth, if you will, despite certain barriers like government control. The free market reform and democracy in Latin America has opened up new markets and new sources of materials and also production. It's an exciting time. We live in a more integrated economy, which provides new opportunities for firms, but political and economic disruption can overthrow plans that are made by organizations. And we're going to talk about how to manage that process. So, is this a good thing? Is the shift towards a more integrated and independent global economy a good thing? It can be, it cannot be. There's many facets to consider. Many experts believe that globalization is promoting greater prosperity in the globe, more jobs, lower prices, and better goods and services. However, there's a group out there that feels that globalization is really not that beneficial. And it's a tough, tough thing to consider. We talk about the DMC right here in Rochester. We talk about the growth opportunity of national brands coming in, bringing jobs. We've had many new brands enter into our market. Since I've lived here, Trader Joe's, this is prior to the announcement of DMC, moved into Rochester. There's supposedly a Whole Foods coming to Rochester here in the near future. But what that also means is that local businesses have a challenge in competing with these new entities that enter the marketplace. The good food store could be pressed to compete if Whole Food comes in. The co-op will be forced to also change its strategy. So you can see both sides of the coin here. So let's look at both sides of the coins here. Critics claim that in advanced economies, low wages are, or rather, jobs are being lost to low-wage nations, if you will. Supporters argue that this job loss is happening, but the economy as a whole is better. So we love going to Walmart and buying cheap stuff, to say the least. And we can only do this because of the efficiencies of one Walmart, but also the manufacturers that sell their product in Walmart. To buy a T-shirt for $3, that's not going to happen here in the United States if they produce that T-shirt at cost of minimum wage, regardless of where you are. But because that is manufactured overseas, you can essentially buy it at a much lower cost. Our economy is moving towards a less productive, not productive, but production focus and more on, in the production of goods, knowledge work, if you will. And free trade in countries has resulted in specialization of goods and services that specific nations can do more effectively, if you will. Importing goods and services that can't be produced effectively is perhaps a better strategy. In doing so, all countries will gain. The U.S. will specialize in certain elements. The Japanese will specialize in other elements. Korea will make all of our goods and services, such as the Samsung Note 3 and things of that nature. Critics argue that free trade encourages firms from advanced nations to move manufacturing offshore and develop countries with lax environmental and labor regulations. However, the other side of the coin is that supporters claim that these environmental regulations and strict labor standards reflect economic progress. So it's another side of this argument that has to be considered. As countries get richer as a result of globalization, they raise their environmental and labor standards as well. Free trade does not lead to more pollution labor, but leads to less, according to supporters. Critics argue that the power is shifting away from governments and towards supranational organizations, or rather greater organizations, such as the WTO, the European Union, and the United Union. Supporters argue that the power of these organizations is limited by the national states, and they all collectively agree to it, essentially. Critics argue that the gap between the rich and the poor is ever growing and there is no equality. Supporters argue that the actions of the governments make limited economic improvement in some countries, that many of the world's poorest nations are under totalitarian rule and regime in particular, and the economy suffers as a result of this. So they try to shift the blame elsewhere. But what does this really mean? Or what does the shift towards a global economy mean for managers within international businesses? Essentially, it means that you have to develop new business skills. You have to be able to manage on a global level. Managing an international business requires managers making different choices, and managing a domestic business can be boiled down into four key areas, particularly a foreign business, if you will. The country definitely influences what the company requires in terms of their various practices, country by country. What works in the Philippines may not work in Thailand, may not work in London, if you will. Managers are faced with a greater and more complex range of problems that they have to account for. International companies must also work within the limits imposed by the government. And be able to leverage the opportunities that present themselves. And then international transactions require converting funds and being susceptible to exchange rate changes on a regular basis. So it's a challenging task, but it's a task that's before us here. Another question you should probably pay attention to is that beginning in the 1970s, Europe and Japanese firms began to shift labor-intensive manufacturing operations from developing nations to their home countries where labor costs are lower. No, they're actually shifting it away and finding cheaper labor offshore, if you will. And that's an introduction to kind of the first chapter here. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns. Thanks for your time.